Hello there, this is David Nguyen, co-founder of Brainscanology and inventor of the LCPC transform. In today's presentation, I'm going to talk about how our technology will revolutionize the assessment of hand drawing and handwriting tests that are important in neurological conditions. In this presentation, I'll be talking about tests that are important for assessing essential tremor, Parkinson's, autism, and developmental coordination disorder. However, at the end of the presentation, I'll briefly talk about how our technology also applies to the movement data that comes from eye tracking and body motion tracking technology. These technologies are important for understanding autism, ADHD, gaze palsies, nystagmus, and body motions such as postural sway. But before we begin, let's talk about how the LCPC transform works. In step one, you have to outline the edge of the shape that you're interested in. In this case, this is one layer in what's called a spiral test, as I'll talk about later. In step two, we overlay a parallel grid system across this shape. That allows us to, as in step three, calculate every intersection between a grid line and the edge of the object. Once we calculate these distances, we can linearize the data as in step four. And for every line that intersects the object more than once, we sum all the distances on that line to get one number. Next, we apply the fast Fourier transform on the data in step 4 to derive a frequency plot, which is a multi-dimensional representation of the shape that we started with in step 1. Lastly, we can derive a scalar value by summing all the bins in a frequency plot such that we get one number to represent the shape that we began with. Let's now talk about hand drawing tests. In this presentation, I'll talk about the spiral test, but before I do so, I want to point out that there are many different drawing tests that are important in neurology. In particular, the clock drawing test is important for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, but I'm not going to talk about this test in this video because this drawing test deserves its own video. For the graphic sequence test, as shown here, the concepts in the latter half of this presentation about handwriting analysis will apply to these kind of drawings. I want to point out that the LCPC transform works on every single drawing test, though some will require more creativity than others. So here are two spiral drawing tests that we adapted from Michalek et al. And here we flipped spiral 2 just so that the axis of the tremor is the same in both spirals. That is, it spans from upper left to bottom right. And we did this just for illustrative purposes. In these two spirals, you can see that the patients exhibit a very different degree of tremor. Now, there are many ways to apply the LCPC grid system to measure these spirals, but for simplicity, let's just focus on the upper half of these spirals. So what we did was we outlined every single concentric ring in the upper half and applied the LCPC transform on each. When we did so, this is what the LCPC transform sees for each layer. Here I've numbered each layer on each spiral. And as you can see, in spiral 1, some layers overlap instead of being neat concentric rings, as can be observed in spiral 2, where each ring does not touch the others. To simplify these graphs, we summed all of the bars into one number for each layer. And when we did that, we found something very interesting. Starting with spiral 1, we see that the tremor increases very quickly and is present very early on. It climbs at layer 2, increases at layer 3, dips a bit at layer 4, because here we know that layer 4 actually intersects with layer 3 instead of being distinct and outside of it. But eventually, as you go to further layers, the tremor increases dramatically. Compare this to spiral 2. Here we see that the longer the patient has to concentrate on this drawing task, the worse the tremor becomes. As you can see visually, each ring, the tremor gets worse and worse, and we see that gradual, consistent increase. And this is the type of information that the LCPC transform can provide. You can detect when rings are not concentric. You can detect when the tremor occurs early on and rises rapidly, or rises gradually. The amazing thing is that this analysis can be done simply with a pencil and paper. There's no need for a digital device such as an iPad or a tablet. So this is great news for rural areas and underdeveloped nations where iPads are scarce. Patients can access our technology for an objective assessment of their spiral test or any other neurological drawing test simply by using a pencil, paper, and the camera on a smartphone. Next, we want to show that we can measure the left or right-handed tilt of a tremor. In this case, we flipped the spiral on the left onto its mirror image. As you can see, the axis of the tremor on the left spans from bottom left to upper right, while on the right side, it's bottom right to upper left. Examining just the upper half of each of these spirals, as we did before, we see that there are regions in the middle in which the left side is very distinct from the right side. When we sum the bars within these green boxes, what we find is that we have two options by which to determine whether a spiral is left-handed or right-handed. Option one is to sum the middle bins of the frequency plot for layer 2 or layer 3, in which case right-handed spirals are greater than left-handed spirals. Option 2 is to sum the middle bins for layers 4 and 5, in which case right-handed spirals will be less than left-handed spirals. Again, this is the depth of information that the LCPC transform can derive. I'd like to point out that we can precisely measure the degree of tilt of any spiral. Current practices depend on crude descriptions, such as the axis of this spiral spans 1 to 2 p.m. to 7 to 8 p.m. While this method does work in classifying the tilt of these spirals, our method can precisely measure every single degree, meaning we can produce much more accurate machine learning models that are rapid and objective. Moving on to handwriting tests, we're going to show that our technology can be quite useful to clinicians who study the progression or response to therapy in neurodivergent populations. Many studies have shown, and I've cited one down here, that neurodivergent children have distinct patterns in their handwriting. Here I've replicated a series of cursive L's. I've controlled for height, meaning they're all the same height, but as you progress from left to right, the size and the shape of the loop changes. When you look at the area of these loops, the data from measuring the area will show minuscule differences that result in noisy data for machine learning. The LCPC transform, however, sees each of these L's very distinctly, and these profiles allow us to derive indices that can discover distinct subtypes of letters for each letter in the alphabet. I want to highlight that with adequate handwriting data, we will be able to discover categories of letter shapes that correlate with different types of neurodivergence and varying degrees of affect in each of those types. Moving on, I want to show that the LCPC transform can detect differences in the size of words and phrases. Here you can see that the large letters have much larger bins, and if you were to sum them, the total would be larger than the total from the left. I want to point out something very specific that the LCPC transform can do that area and volume cannot. You can compare individual letters and scale them to be the same height while maintaining the height to width aspect ratio. In this case, you can compare the difference in shape between the letter A from the left and the letter A from the right. And this is something that is special to the LCPC transform. Next, I wanted to show that our technology can also detect the difference in spacing between letters in a word or between words in a sentence. Here I've created the same spelling of the word cat, but just with varying spacing between the letter A and T. When you apply the parallel grid system and do LCPC transform, what you see is the graph on the bottom left. It's obvious that the longer the word is in total, the more bins are involved in the frequency plot. Therefore, the simplest index is simply to sum the total number of bins in each graph. Now, in this case, I controlled for the shape of the letters in each case, because they're the same ones, The only thing I changed was the spacing. However, in real handwriting samples, each letter has slight variations each time it's repeated. And the LCPC transform can extract multiple features of information in the same readout. That is, the size of the letters, how slanted they are, and also the spacing that's different. Now I'm going to briefly talk about how the LCPC transform can measure hidden information from spatial patterns derived from eye tracking technology and body motion tracking technology. Eye tracking technology comes from devices such as smart glasses, smartphones, and eye tracking cameras that are on your desktop or on the dashboards of cars and trucks. Eye tracking is useful for the study of various types of nystagmus, various types of gaze palsies, and for finding subtypes of epilepsy. Body motion data comes from devices such as smartwatches, smart rings, smart bracelets, and smart body braces. These data are important for studying things like postural sway, abnormal gait and stride in walking patterns, and in the tremor of appendages such as your arm or your leg. Motion tracking data often look like these complicated squiggly patterns. Current methods turn these patterns into clouds of space. They then measure features such as the area of the cloud or the density within the clouds. The LCPC transform can measure spatial information distinctly from clouds and densities and can extract novel information that complements the current methods. Let's provide some context as to what these squiggly patterns represent. These two patterns can be derived from patients before treatment or after treatment. For example, in the case of facial recognition, before treatment, instead of focusing on the eyes, nose, and mouth of the image, the patient's eyes are easily distracted to different areas of the head. After treatment, however, the patient focuses more on the eyes, nose, and mouth, as is the case in neurotypical individuals. Now, in the context of arm tremor, this patient might be having a hard time putting a book back onto its proper place on the shelf. However, after treatment, the reduced range of tremor means that the patient has an easier time putting a book back where it belongs. In terms of how the LCPC can measure these complex shapes, it can measure the entire cloud, or it can measure individual strokes, that is, the individual lines that comprise these clouds. I want to reiterate that shape is more than just the area of a heat map cloud and more than the average density of a heat map cloud. The information that the LCPC transform can extract will complement existing methods in producing much more accurate machine learning models. Thank you for your attention. For more information, feel free to visit brainscanology.com. For consulting services and software licensing, feel free to reach out at info@brainscanology.com.